Okay, so the whole idea is, the geopolitics of energy. And I'm going to throw out a whole bunch. I'm going to go fast because everyone says you're the smartest people in the world, so you can take this. So I'm going to go fast because I want to cover a lot, and probably too much. And I'll probably go over, but you'll also tell me that too. Okay, so a funny thing. So I'm a PhD geochemist, geologist, started out in planetary science, which is kind of neat. Then the Challenger blew up and I got into nuclear waste. Okay, so it's an interesting story, but it actually makes sense. Judith Wright and I, we came up to the Hanford site in 1987 when it was still weird. And we've been scientists. But a couple years ago, Forbes magazine asked me to blog for them, and I thought they were nuts. It's interesting. I didn't have a Facebook, didn't Twitter. I didn't tweet, sorry. I didn't do any of that. Okay, I didn't know anything about that. And they said, well, that's okay. We need someone to explain energy and nuclear from a scientist standpoint. I actually had taken one of the editors down into the nuclear waste repository in New Mexico that everyone has heard of, right? You all know that we've been disposing of nuclear waste half mile below the earth for the last 15 years? No, okay. We've been doing that, so it's really cool. So we're standing down half mile below the earth in this huge salt deposit, standing in front of nuclear waste, some of it really hot, some of it not, and talking about nuclear, and he said, well, gee, would you like to blog for Forbes? And I said, okay. So the first couple I did, he said, Jim, you sound like Wikipedia. Could you get some attitude? So that's where we've been going. So I'm trying to do attitude here. Okay, so I want to talk about energy. What do we use energy for? How do we get it? What's a good mix? We use energy primarily to produce electricity or for transportation. Now, we're not going to talk about transportation much here because that's all petroleum. I'm going to talk about producing electricity. And we produce electricity for light, heat, and power, right? Very, very important. I'm going to use the kilowatt hour as the main unit. Okay, I don't care about installed gigawatts. Not a good unit. A unit that you want to use is kilowatt hour because that's what comes in the end of the month in your bill. If you're a homeowner, or you will be soon, you will be paying for electricity in the kilowatt hour at the end of the month, every month. Okay? So kilowatt hour is a good unit. Everyone knows it, even if you're not a scientist. The other thing is it's a production number. It's what's produced. A kilowatt is not a production, it's a capacity. And you might produce a kilowatt for an hour, and that's a kilowatt hour, but if you only produce it for 5 minutes, it's not. So you want to use kilowatt hour, it's what is produced, and it's how you can normalize and talk about different energy sources by using the same units. In the United States, we generally pay about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. This is changing dramatically year to year. Washington State is the cheapest of any state. Absolutely the cheapest because of hydro, nuclear, and limited wind. It's always been cheap. It's great. Really nice. Connecticut is a little bit more expensive. Hawaii is very expensive, just like everything in Hawaii is very expensive because you've got to ship it in, essentially. But even so, compared to the rest of the world, the United States is very cheap. We have very cheap power. We've always had very cheap power, and we probably will. Okay? Germany is a little bit more expensive, of course. France is a little bit cheaper than the rest of Europe because they have so much nuclear, and England's pretty much a good proxy. Now, what do we use energy for? What do we use the wind for? What do we use coal for? We essentially want to turn a dynamo. And I don't know if you know what a dynamo is. It's just a big wheel that turns a metallic shaft inside a stationary metallic wrapping. If you've ever used the flashlight that you go like this, it's a little dynamo. It's exactly how we produce electricity. We've been doing it for 150 years, and all we're doing is trying to make better dynamos. And we're trying to turn them better and more efficiently. So you see this picture? This looks like a turbine, right? Looks right? That's a 1903 photograph of a Russian turbine. Okay? Hasn't changed in 100 years. It will probably not change in another 100. Okay? So that's what it is. All we're doing is trying to find some way to turn that. And mainly we figured out we can use the wind to turn a rotor that turns a turbine, or we can use falling water to turn a turbine. Generally, we heat water into steam that then turns a turbine. So it doesn't matter whether you're using coal, gas, geothermal, or nuclear, you're heating water into steam and to turn a turbine. That's all you're doing. Nothing special, no little nuclear bombs in there going off. It's just getting hot, and you're turning water into steam. Now, the thing that does not turn a turbine is photovoltaic solar. That's great. But the big solar, the big concentrated solars, those turn a turbine. So they heat a heat exchanging fluid, whether it's alcohol or molten salt, in this little tube, and it goes down and heats water into steam and turns a turbine. So there's nothing special going on here. So photovoltaics, the only thing that doesn't turn a turbine. Oops. Now, no one wants to talk about energy without talking about climate change, right? Fine. It's not just about climate, okay? And it's not just about CO2. It's about everything, okay? So climate, yeah, the big long-term effect, climate change, that's great. We've been warming. I'll talk about that a little bit. Pretty much we need to be ready for climate change. Climate change is happening. It's been happening for the last 300 years. We've exacerbated it. It's climbing a little bit faster. We need to be ready for it. Okay, we need to be ready. We need better fire protection. We need, don't build at sea level anymore. All these kind of issues that you need to be ready for this because it is coming. But there's a lot of short-term effects. I'm sorry, let me get back here. If you look at the last 500 million years in terms of temperature, the Earth's temperature has generally been pretty warm. We're in a huge cooling trend. The last 10 million years has been very cold. Okay, we've had some major glaciations that we haven't had for a while before that, but it's been pretty cold. And yeah, in the last 300 years we've been warming, and we're warming pretty fast. In the last 100 years we're warming actually pretty fast. But this is, it's been warm before. This is not the issue. The real issue is the rate of change. Okay, the biosphere doesn't like change at all. Okay, if you change too fast, things die. And okay, we're going to change fast, things are going to die. Get ready for it. A lot of things that we like will die, unfortunately. But the Earth will be fine. The biosphere is not going to go away. We're not going to go extinct. But we will lose a lot of things we actually like. And that's the real issue. I mean, this is what world do you want to be in 50 years, or you want your grandchildren to be in 100 years? So it's not about the Earth's going to go extinct, a lot of life's going to die. Okay? It's simply, it's going to change. A lot of things die when things change fast. Right? But it is interesting to look at the various changes. This cooling trend, by the way, gave rise to Homo sapiens, so it's actually a nice thing. All right. The short-term effects, there's a lot of short-term effects, have nothing to do with climate change. The worst thing, if you have to, again, pick an evil energy source, I like to pick coal, because coal is really nasty stuff, but people rag on coal a lot. I like to rag on coal. You really can't, because again, it gave us modern society, so it's kind of hard to rag on it. But it is very nasty material when you burn it. Okay? And the main thing is the lungs do not like burnt particulates. That's why smoking cigarettes really is bad. The lungs do not like particulates, especially burnt carbon particulates. They're kind of second to asbestos and beryllium, so don't like that. Now, China recently built 600 coal-fired power plants over an 18-year period, and it lifted them, or 500 million of them, up into the middle class. But it also has caused a lot of healthcare issues in China because they decided not even to scrub at the beginning. So their exhaust, they weren't even scrubbing. Because it takes about 5% of the energy of a coal-fired power plant to scrub the exhaust. Okay, and that's a lot of energy. So if you're dying for energy, you don't even scrub. But then you get to the point where your healthcare costs are now becoming important. And you have to rethink this. And if you've ever seen pictures of Beijing recently, not a nice place to be in. It's hard to see across the street. So about 300,000 people a year are dying in China because of coal particulates. And that's a problem. Only about 20,000 a year die in the US. That's much better. We actually care about the environment more. We scrub our exhaust. That's fine. 20,000 is still a little too much as far as I'm concerned, but that's just the price of doing business. There's a nice study in Canada that showed if your society or your economy is fueled significantly by coal, your healthcare costs are increased by about 10%. So there's a major trade-off here. So 10% of our healthcare costs in this country is about $300 billion. So we pretty much are subsidizing this energy source by our healthcare costs. And it's not trivial. So you look at the numbers for different energy sources, what actually kills you in terms of energy. Yeah, coal's right up there, always been up there. China, the worst. US, a lot better. This is normalized per trillion kilowatt hours. Okay, you got to normalize these numbers so they don't mean anything. And so, yeah, so again, fossil fuels the worst. and then renewables are the best. And nuclear is, of course, very good. Next, there are direct environmental harm. I mean, spills, BP, pipeline breaks. These are direct environmental impact, have nothing to do with global warming again. And if you've ever seen a collapsed coal impoundment, it's very nasty stuff. Happens way too frequently. But again, it's nothing to do with global warming, but it is a huge environmental impact from fossil fuel. And then ocean acidification. I'm a geologist. This scares me a lot more than global warming. It's a lot faster, and it's going on right now. For a variety of reasons, I follow the fishing stocks in the northern Pacific. And of course, they're moving south now because the pH has dropped 0.1 in the northern Pacific. And that interrupts the base of the food chain. And so the fishing stocks are moving south, and they're getting thinner. So this is real. It's immediate. It's a problem. And if you look at global biogeochemical cycles, they're all interactive, okay? They're all mixed up. So when you put CO2 in the atmosphere, it goes into a few places. One place it goes to quickly is it dissolves in the upper layers of the ocean. So seawater, just Henry's law constant. So you have a gas that's in contact with water, a certain fraction of that, Henry's law constant fraction, will dissolve in that water. And when you dissolve CO2 in ocean water, it forms carbonic acid, and that lowers the pH. So the more you pump into the atmosphere, the more dissolves in water, and the lower the pH of the ocean. It takes a huge amount to have even a small change because the volumes are so huge, but it's very important. The main way we get CO2 out of ocean water is to precipitate carbonate rocks and carbonate shells and things like that. And that cycle is about 1,000 years. So if you pump CO2 quickly into the atmosphere, it will eventually come out, and you'll reach an equilibrium, but the time scales of both of those are so different that you back it up basically, and you start lowering the pH of the seawater, and it takes a long time to precipitate carbonate rocks out of that ocean. Never mind. So what you see, in the last few decades is, again, CO2 is going up, CO2 dissolved in water is going up, and global seawater pH is going down. This is much more scary to me as a geologist than global warming, because it's much faster and has immediate effects. So if you look, because Henry's law constant is a function of temperature, the colder water absorbs more CO2. So you see these effects basically in polar water as opposed to equatorial water. Okay. Shout out to me, what do you think the fastest growing energy source in the world is? Come on, shout it out. I have not heard the right answer. Coal. This is a bummer. This is a real bummer because it is screaming high. It is not just slightly going up. It is screaming going up. It has nothing to do with the U.S., of course. I mean, we actually have the luxury of choosing various energy sources. But the reason it's going up so fast is because coal is the only energy source that you need very little infrastructure to take advantage of. You can build a coal-fired power plant. You can train it or truck in coal, and you can fire it up. You don't need pipelines. You don't need a whole bunch of infrastructure. You need some, you need some grid. But essentially, you can install coal in a third world country, developing country, easily, more easily than any other source of energy. And that's why it's going on. So that's why coal is screaming high. Now, pay attention to these units. I don't have to explain units to you, hopefully, because it'll slow me down, and I want to go fast. So again, so think of this here. And then the next one, what's the next fastest growing source of energy? Natural gas. Natural gas. So it's also screaming. And again, we have a lot of natural gas. This is the units are half of what the others were, so coal is even worse on this graph. And again, it's, the developed countries have the luxury of installing gas, and we have a lot of natural gas. Okay, are the others going? Not so good. Okay, so again, contrary to what you might think, okay, fossil fuels are still growing over everything else combined, much more. So this is a problem. If you care about global warming, if you care about the state of the environment, this is what you have to worry about. And this is tricky. It's really tricky. All right. I love these NASA nighttime shots because you can tell right away who has energy and who doesn't. Right? This is actually, you could subject this to a spectral analysis. The brighter, the more energy. So you can see there's some really good bright spots there. This area is coming on like gangbusters, and this is coming up too. There's a lot of areas that are dark. Some have no people in them. Sahara Desert, not very populous. But there's a lot of people here. They have no energy. Now, if you look at the distribution by type, the world is 2/3 fossil fuel and 1/3 split almost equally between nuclear and hydro. It's been that way for 40 years. It will be that way for another 40 unless we take ambitious action. Now, again, transportation is all petroleum. Won't talk about that much. But where you live is very dependent on what that ratio is, that mix. So in the United States, still 2/3 fossil fuel, although these two keep exchanging places every 6 months, depending on what's going on. If you have a polar vortex, gas shuts down. Doesn't work very well. Coal goes up. So, but these keep changing, okay? But they're together about 2/3, right? Again, we have a little bit more nuclear, a little less hydro. Wind is coming up, other is not. But even in the United States, it depends on where you live. Washington State is the least carbon intensive of any state. In fact, the least carbon intensive of any modern society in the world because of hydro, nuclear, and a little bit of wind. Okay? Kentucky is the most carbon intensive of any state. And Illinois is the most nuclear. They're 50% nuclear. Obama knows nuclear very well. He likes it. He's just not allowed to talk about it very much. The European Union, the European Union is, again, about the same, a little bit more nuclear because of France, a little less hydro. Korea, notice, is about 1/3 nuclear, just like Japan was before Fukushima. And the reason they are planning to be 70% nuclear by 2050. 70% nuclear. Why? Why would they want so much nuclear? They have nothing else. They have no other resources. They don't even have wind or solar resources enough to do anything. They don't have enough biomass to even grow their own food. They have no oil or gas. So they need, unless they want to be completely dependent on some place like China, which is not a good idea, they have to come up with something that is self-sufficient, and that's nuclear. So, in China, again, it's all coal right now, but it's coming up high. They are planning 400 new nuclear power plants by 2040 and a slew of everything else. Because they need energy, they have a lot of people, and they just need a lot of energy. Now the reason, okay, so this is the world power consumption growth curve. It's very steep, has nothing to do with the US. Here we are right now, it's 17 trillion kilowatt hours a year for the world. The United States is still about 4 trillion, we're kind of leveled out. The big question is, where's this going to go? Is it going to keep going on and on and on, or is it going to turn over at some amount, and I'll throw out 30 trillion kilowatt hours, and we'll talk about why. So if you're going to get to 30, so say you're going to get to 30, and right now fossil fuel produces 2/3 of 17 or so, say about 10, then that means if you care about any of the environmental issues we talk about, if you actually care about it, then you're going to have to come up with 20 trillion kilowatt hours or so of non-fossil fuel. Just to keep fossil fuel where it is now. Not to roll it back or anything, but just to keep it where it is now, you're going to have to come up with 20 trillion in non-fossil fuel. Who thinks that's likely? This is where we go have margaritas someplace, because this is a tough one. This is the issue. Nothing else really matters. Everything else is detail. Okay? If you care about decreasing or even keeping CO2 emissions the same as they are now, you're going to have to come up with 20 trillion kilowatt hours of something else besides oil, gas, and coal. Right? This is the map of global energy poverty. The reason that growth curve is so steep is because of these people. There are 1.6 billion people have no access to electricity whatsoever. 2.4 people still burn wood and manure as their main source of energy, and 3 billion more people are going to come on board by 2040. This is a lot of people, a lot of people. And you might say, well, Forget them. Who cares? We have our energy. We care about global warming, so we're just going to, they don't need it. Forget it. Okay, well, that's kind of mean, first of all. But second, it has ramifications. Because if you've ever looked at the United Nations Human Development Index, anyone know about HDI? It's great. It's a great subject. It's everything. This is it. This is the sum total of energy in this talk. Okay? It takes about 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year to have what we consider a good life. Okay? So the Human Development Index goes from a really bad life to a really good life at 1. Okay? The developed world, which includes the US, is about 0.9. Okay? We have a good life. That's why everyone wants to come here. This is no secret. Okay? It's a good life because we have a lot of energy. A lot of energy. These people have no energy or very little energy. They don't have a good life. So is it coincidental that all the problem spots in the world are down here? Is that coincidental? No. You can shout out. I like shouting out. It's okay. No, it is not coincidental. This is the issue. Now getting back to 1850, before I messed my shoulder up, I could produce 11 kilowatt hours of useful muscular work each year. Okay? Now if I use a few tools and stuff, I can increase that dramatically. It's really hard to dig a hole with your hands, but it's really easy with a shovel. It takes less energy. If you use horses and oxen, wow, you really get a lot of energy. And of course, a person in a diesel backhoe can just run rings around that. So prior to 1850, this is what you're dealing with. Okay? And that's why if you wanted a good life, if you were a 17th century nobleman or something, you needed to have a lot of people giving you their energy in order for you to have a good life. And that's what it was all about. In fact, it's a great calculation for students. If you are a 17th century nobleman with 10 indentured servants, 10 slaves, 4 ox, and 4 horses, you were getting the equivalent of 3,100 kilowatt hours per year for your noble family. Everyone else, of course, wasn't getting anything. So 1850 comes along, and suddenly you don't have to own anyone. You can burn coal. That took a while to get going, but again, by 1870, Britain had 10 million middle-class Brits. Okay? And they could make steel like crazy. They could drive steam like crazy. So the British Empire, right, there's no question why the Brits basically led the world in the second half of the 19th century. Okay, they had steam-powered battleships. I mean, that is really something. Now, the United States, of course, about the turn of the century, we developed oil. The Brits hated oil. They had all coal. They didn't have any oil. We had a lot of oil. And suddenly, we started running rings around their battleships because we had oil-fired battleships. We were really quite good. And then we came on with hydro and gas and nuclear. So by 1950, the United States had 100 million middle class, and it dwarfed the rest of the world. And by 1970, we had 200 million middle class. And about that time, we stopped installing a lot of energy, which is kind of funny. But that's, at about that time, about 1990, China decided, it wasn't any secret, this is not a secret here, that they needed to install a bunch of energy. And in 1992, the Chinese Politburo was 80% scientists and engineers. Think of Congress as 80% scientists and engineers. Now, it's still authoritarian government. Authoritarian governments have their own problems, of course. They do stupid things. But they decided that they were going to produce a lot of energy, and they started building coal-fired power plants like nobody's business. So by 2010, China split. Okay, this is China. This is average. But because of this huge expanse of coal, China now has 500 million middle-class Chinese. 500 million middle class. Now, since your military and economic strength derive directly from the absolute number of middle class in your society, there is no question why suddenly China doesn't really care if the United States president visits them. They used to, but now they don't. Okay, so if you look, now they still have 800 million in abject poverty. So if you look at all their economic, all their military, all their policies, It's all geared to moving those 800 million up into the middle class. And that includes installing a lot of energy. So they're still building coal plants. They're trying to make them cleaner, but they're building more gas. They're building more renewables than anyone else, and they're building more nuclear than anyone else. So by mid-century, China will have over 1 billion middle class. Okay. Now there actually is a region in here that is reasonable, sustainable, and ethical. Ethical meaning, yes, get everyone up there, get everyone down there, and that's the minimum amount of energy you need to eradicate global poverty and its evil stepchildren, war and terrorism. You need to give everyone that much energy. And that's what it's all about. That's what the fighting's all about. So it's always been about. So how do you do that? You get everyone down here, because this is a waste. We don't need 10,000 kilowatt hours per person per year in the United States. That's a waste. We can be more efficient. We can be reasonable. We don't need that. Canada, it's big and cold. They're stuck. Too bad. It's too bad. But there's not many people there. So globally, it doesn't really affect very much. But the big countries in the U.S. affect a lot because we use a lot of energy. We have a lot of people. Okay. So get everyone there, get everyone there. What is that going to take? All right, this is what it's going to take. So you have a bunch of people in the industrialized world. Cut us down to 6,000. It's actually reasonable. We can do that. There's a lot of people at 3,000. Keep them there. It's these two groups. 4 billion, you have to get up to 3,000 kilowatt hours, and 3 billion more being born by 2040 that you have to get up to 3,000 kilowatt hours. So the minimum amount of energy, if you want what we consider a peaceful world, everyone having a nice life, and it should be a goal, we're going to have to produce about 30 trillion kilowatt hours. And this includes a little bit of efficiency, more than we have now, and it includes all energy sources we can possibly get onto the grid. You got that? 30 trillion. Not a trivial number. Okay, so this is what Judith and I came up with, a third, a third, and a third. So a third fossil fuel, a third renewable, and a third nuclear by 2040 will actually meet that goal. It's doable. It's not, I mean, I'd like another mixture, but it's doable. And you can actually, it's achievable in terms of cost, and we'll talk about cost. So what this means that you're going to have to build much more renewables than you possibly can dream of. I mean, no one has ever talked about building 4 million big turbines, big wind turbines. I mean, that's a lot. What's the problem with that many wind turbines?
You could alter the wind flow, and anything that flies in that area is probably die.
That's one thing. Land use, yeah, huge amount of land, but even more than that. That will take 4 billion tons of steel. 4 billion tons of steel, and a lot of copper, and a lot of cement too. So the thing with wind turbines is a material issue. We don't have that much spare steel. I mean, again, if you don't build anything else, we can do it. 1,700 new nuclear reactors, Gen 3 and 4, not Gen 2. No one's going to build an old reactor from now on, but the new ones. 1,700, that sounds like a lot, doesn't it? We have 400 in the world now. It sounds like a lot. That's actually the easiest on this group in terms of achievability. 100 billion barrels of biofuels, that's a lot. 3 trillion from hydro, that's a lot. And 4 trillion from everything else. And the reason these numbers are in the trillions is if it's not in the trillions, it's of no effect globally, right? I mean, if you have to go by 30 trillion kilowatt hours and you produce 1 billion kilowatt hours from something really cool, okay, that's great. You can take an entire village off the grid. That's wonderful. But you're not going to affect the globe unless you get into the trillion kilowatt hour range, because we're talking about 30 trillion kilowatt hours. That's why the numbers matter. I mean, the numbers are big, and they matter. So here's where we are now. Here's where we want to get to. Now, talking about, why is nuclear down here? Are we going to have nuclear-powered cars? I hope not. No, we're not going to have nuclear-powered cars. That's dumb. But if you're going to have fully electric vehicles, how are we going to charge them? Right? So a fully electric vehicle in the state of Washington is really good because we have very low-carbon electricity here. So it's actually quite green. It's the equivalent of over 100 miles per gallon internal combustion engine if you have a fully electric vehicle in the state of Washington. If you have a fully electric vehicle in Kentucky, it's the same as having a 30 mile per gallon internal combustion car, because the electricity produces that much CO2. So again, it matters how you charge your vehicle if you're going to change the transportation sector in terms of CO2 emissions. So you're going to need a lot of base load. You're never going to get rid of petroleum. Long haulers, jet fuel, stuff like that, you're going to need a fair amount of petroleum. But you can cut it down dramatically with biofuels, combination of biofuels and base load, and that base load should be nuclear as opposed to coal or gas. Okay, is the rest of the world thinking of this at all? This is India's planned power installation over the next 40 years. It is exactly like the United States is today. So this mix, this is fossil fuel, this is nuclear, this is hydro, and they're planning to build 100 new nuclear power plants. So it sounds like a lot, but it's really nothing compared to the 800 coal-fired power plants they're planning to build. So this mix, both in absolute magnitude as well as percentage, is about the same as the United States was actually in 2006. So this is business as usual. Business as usual. I don't mean to bum everyone out, but you know, these are realities. This is what you have to fight against. This is the issue. It's not, you know, it's not putting solar cells on your roof, although I just did that last week. It's actually quite cool. But you know, it's the world. The world has different priorities than the United States, right? Different priorities, like eating, things like that. So you have to deal with their priorities more than ours. We have our idea of what we care about, but if you don't care about these other 6 billion by 2040, if you don't care about their needs and what they require, then you're going to fail. And that's why Kyoto failed, that's why Copenhagen failed, and the next one's going to fail unless we have two different strategies for those two different groups on the HDI curve, right? Okay, how much is it going to cost? Oh God, I'm going really slow. All right, okay, cost. I want to talk about cost, actual cost, not price. What you pay for electricity has nothing to do with how much it costs to produce it. You understand that, right? You know that, right? Someone has to make a buck, a lot of bucks, and so what you pay for it has nothing to do with the cost of producing that kilowatt hour. But if you're going to plan for the future, if you're going to come up with policy, and you want to see, well, where would we want to be at 2050? You need to know what it actually costs to produce that electricity. How you finance it later is completely different, and you better finance it well, or you're going to be stuck with gas. So this is, you know, let's go over the cost. So these are real numbers, and I'm going to throw out something. Okay, let's just do it. All right, I'm going to throw out this number, 469 billion kilowatt hours. So you're going to build something, whatever, a solar array, a bunch of wind turbines, a nuclear power plant, 10 coal plants, whatever you're going to build, you want to produce 469 billion kilowatt hours over the life of that unit or array, right? So we have to normalize. You cannot compare anything unless you normalize these numbers. So we're going to say we want to produce that much, and how much is it going to cost, and what it's going to do. So as our input, we're going to look at 6 different energy sources. We're going to use these reference spot prices. You don't have to care about that right now. Do you know what a capacity factor is? Capacity factor is a 1 megawatt wind turbine. If the wind is blowing between 25 miles an hour and 40 miles an hour, it will produce 1 megawatt continuously. If it produces that for an hour, it's 1 megawatt hour. Okay? If it only works 20% of the time or 30% of the time, then it will only produce 0.3 megawatt hours in general. Okay? So the capacity factor is the ratio of what it actually produces to what it could produce if it were putting out 24/7. Right? So the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine all the time, coal doesn't run all the time because you have to do maintenance, you have to fuel, stuff like that. So these are the capacity factors. This is how often it is running compared to how it could be running if everything were ideal. The lifespan, of course, that's very important. The installed capacity. So you're going to build a 750 megawatt coal-fired power plant. It's going to work for 40 years. It's going to operate 71% of the time. It's going to cost you $2.5 billion to build, right? Just the construction cost. And these people just put one in. So these are real costs, real things that have been bought in the last 15 months. So let's put that. It's just algebra. So let's look at coal. 2.5 billion kilowatt hours in 750 megawatt capacity, turn it into kilowatts, because that's what we care about. It operates 71% of the time. There's 8,766 hours in a year. It works for 40 years. That's what you're going to get out of this plant. That's it. And that's if it works really great, okay? If you have fires and explosions and stuff, you shut it down, you get less. But that's about what you're going to get. You're not going to get any more out of this power plant. And you're going to have paid $2.5 billion for it. So that's coal. Now to produce 469, because I want to normalize this, 469 billion kilowatt hours, you're going to have to build 2.5 of them. We're just normalizing. And it's going to cost you $6.2 billion. Okay. You do this with all of these. Okay. This is gas. Oh, very cheap. You can throw up a gas-fired power plant quickly, cheaply. That's why we're doing it. Okay. You can also get it regulatorily passed very easily too. So yeah, okay, you're going to have 2 units, and it's going to cost you only $1.6 billion. Next one, nuclear. You need to build 1. Okay, but it's very expensive to build 1. Okay, so it's going to cost you $7 billion to build 1 plant, but it will still produce 469 billion kilowatt hours over its life, because it runs so long and it runs so often. Wind. You need a lot of wind turbines to produce 469 billion kilowatt hours. It's going to take you a lot in construction, much more than you think. Okay. And then solar, it's going to take a really lot. But this is okay. Solar will come down. Solar is the only one that actually responds to technological advances really quickly. So it will come down, no question. But it's expensive to build. And then hydro, it's about the same as nuclear and coal. Okay, this is what it costs to construct these only. Now you're operating them. Here's where things change. There's no fuel costs here. All right? Fossil fuel is all about the fuel. So the longer and nuclear fuel is cheap, the longer you run these for, the more cost effective they become. It costs a lot to build up front, huge amount to build up front, but once they're built, they're very cheap to operate, there's no fuel costs, and so you want to run these as long as possible. These, however, once you build them, the more you run them, the less cost effective they become, because it's all about the fuel, and fuel is very expensive. And this is gas prices incredibly inexpensive. They will go up. We just have a lot of fracking craze right now. But again, the longer you run these two, the least cost effective they become. The longer you run these, the more cost effective they become. Now there's O&M costs that are kind of all over the board. We know these very well, except solar. We haven't run the big ones very long enough to get a good idea of what the operational costs are, but these are all well known and they're kind of all over the board. So if you integrate these over the lifespan, this is what it comes out to be over their lifespan. Okay? In terms of what construction, operation, and fueling, this is what it costs. This is what it will cost per kilowatt hour for each of these sources. Now again, solar will come down. It's just expensive now. It'll come down. But what strikes you right away? Right away, except for solar.
They're equal.
Yeah, they're all the same. They really are all the same. If you run their life. Now, if you want to make a lot of money in the first 5 years, well, nuclear isn't going to do it, okay, because there's a huge upfront cost, and it takes 15 years to pay that off. But it runs for 60 years. Okay, so, but in terms of society, what it's going to cost you, your choice of energy sources shouldn't be on cost, because they're all the same. And solar will come down. But this isn't the reason you should choose an energy source. So because they all cost about the same, now you're free to actually care about other things, like reliability or environmental effects or CO2. I mean, now you make your decision now based on what you care about in the long term, because the long-term costs are all about the same. The problem is you have to get investors to invest in these. And right now everyone's investing in gas because they can get quick return, because it's cheap to build. So this is where the government comes in. So you want loan guarantees for the long term, because the government actually cares about what happens, or you should care about what happens in the future. And since we are the government here, we're the people, we should be determining this long-term approach. Exxon isn't going to make this decision for us. Okay, please don't believe that. It's up to us. It's up to the government. So you want to we don't have an energy plan in this country, so we need to get an energy plan, and we have to, where do you want to be in 50 years, and then you decide what mix you want and how you're going to get there. Okay, just looking at the costs. Okay, let's say by 2040, the United States is going to be producing 6.5 trillion kilowatt hours a year. What is it going to cost for that? Well, if business as usual, it's going to cost 7.5 trillion, and 1.7 trillion is going to be capital investment. The reason I picked 2040 is by that point, all the existing energy systems we have now will be dead and gone, except the big hydro. Okay, so we will have to replace everything by 2040. So this is what it's going to cost to do that, with the present mix of 2/3 fossil fuel and 1/3 everything else. If you go to this third, it's going to cost almost about the same, but it's going to cost a lot more in capital. Now, what's the difference between this and this? It's the amount of fossil fuel you're buying. Okay? This, you're actually building something. Actually, building something is a good thing. Building infrastructure is a good thing rather than paying the same amount for fuel that goes up into the atmosphere. So it's the same amount of cost, but this one gives you much less CO2 in much more in infrastructure and less fuel. So even though the same cost, this third, saves 2 billion tons of CO2 a year, and the healthcare savings, because you've decreased coal so much, actually pays for all the infrastructure anyway. So again, this is, no one ever talks about these kind of costs, but they're actually quite important. And what can change these costs? The price of everything, of course. So this is the amount of concrete and steel that each of these takes. And again, wind is way out here. It takes a lot of steel, a lot of concrete per megawatt hour installed. And so if the price of steel goes up, then the price of wind goes up. So the price of things changes the cost of this, right? Okay, what about the other costs, the externalities? Those other costs that no one ever captures, that's not in your bill at the end of the month. Those are called externality costs, external costs. So usually we capture those in two ways. We capture the environmental costs in terms of CO2. That's just a proxy for everything. And then we also use the footprint, the physical footprint, how much of the environment we're actually impacting in terms of area. So if you look at, sorry, I've got a little weird things here. This is CO2, and this is area, square miles, to produce 1 billion kilowatt hours of electricity. So fossil fuel is all about the fuel, so it's all about the CO2. It doesn't take much area, but it takes a lot of fuel, and you produce a lot of CO2. Renewables take a lot of area, not much CO2 produced, but it takes a lot of area. And nuclear takes neither, which is kind of bizarre. If you put a carbon tax, this is what the increase in fuel costs with a carbon tax of $15 per ton of CO2 emitted. So again, it affects fossil fuel, it doesn't affect the others.
Are your solar numbers for concentrated solar or PV?
Actually, it's a mix. It's a mix. Now, PV solar produces CO2 during the construction, during the manufacture. It doesn't produce anything afterwards. Same thing with wind. All of the wind CO2 is produced during manufacture, during mining of steel and smelting and construction. Hydro and nuclear, it's mainly in cement. They're very cement intensive. So especially hydro. That's why hydro is so big. It's just a huge amount of cement. Now what about the death print? Oh, well, okay. Well, let's push coal off because coal's death print is so large. This is a number of, it's a good term. Death print is a very good term, like carbon footprint. So again, coal is way above everything else, and the others are much smaller, but gas is not trivial, and hydro is not trivial. Dams don't fail often, but when they do, they wipe out towns, and they kill a lot of people. If any of you remember the Banquio failure of 1976, I think it was, he killed 171,000 people. Okay, doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's bad. So that's where these numbers come from this that I showed before. Okay. All right, so rank these in terms of most dangerous to least dangerous. Just shout it out. What's the most dangerous on this list?
Automobile driving.
Yeah. That includes suicide, which is actually a huge percentage of that number. But that's okay. I heard the top three. usually the top three. Okay, if you talk to the person on the street, they're always smoking in nuclear, which is kind of funny. But that's, smoking bad, smoking bad. Okay, here are the numbers. What the hell's iatrogenic? It's the leading cause of death in the United States. Heath Ledger was an iatrogenic death. I hate it that he died, but everyone knows his name. Actually, Michael Jackson was an iatrogenic death, but it was ruled a homicide, but it was actually iatrogenic. Medicine gone wrong. It's not abuse. Properly taken, properly prescribed prescription drugs, proper medical procedures, proper surgical procedures, just don't know why the patient died. It's really why you don't want to check into a hospital unless you absolutely need to. And it's true. I mean, this is not a trivial thing. As the aging population in the United States, there's much more medical procedures going on, and it's killing a lot of people. It is a huge issue. Food poisoning. Why are we still killing people with burgers? I mean, this is really stupid. But, and then coal use, murder, not very well. It's there, but it's, and of course, and this is bad. This is one guy who fell off a ladder and broke his neck. Okay, that's fine. Now I got a lot of grief from a biostatistician who said I hadn't normalized to the subject population. Smoking really is the worst. Always has been, always will be. Again, the lungs do not like burnt carbon particles, and it is the worst. But not that many people smoke. 43 million is pretty good. But a lot of people receive medical treatment, and a lot of people eat. So it's nice to know that eating is only slightly more dangerous than nuclear energy. And now here, my police work, not many people died, but the risk is high because there's not that many police officers and not that many miners either. So again, the relative risk, what's going to kill you, what you should be worried about is usually not what you think. And you really need to worry about medicine. Okay. Now, even non-lethal routine accidents like falling off a ladder, it is safer to work at a nuclear power plant than it is to sit at a desk trading stocks. Now, why is that? You know why. Why is that?
People go postal.
No. Everything in a nuclear power plant is proceduralized to the nth degree. I had to take ladder training. And I have to have 2 qualified operators to operate a ladder. Do you think anyone ever falls off a ladder, except the guy that died a few years ago? But no one ever falls off a ladder. No one. No one ever, runs a forklift into something. No one ever does that. Everything is so proceduralized, and if you do not follow that procedure, you are fired on the spot. Okay, so, because everyone's afraid, right? And it's good, be very afraid. So industrial accidents, which are the main cause of death in the industrialized world, in terms of work-related deaths, no, you never have those in a nuclear power plant because you do the same thing over and over again. Now, someone at the 7th story of the AIG building in New York is standing on a rolling chair hanging a picture. You know that, right? And so they're going to fall off, they're going to break their arm. That's what goes into these OSHA numbers. It's not that it's any inherently more dangerous to work trading stocks, but no one cares about safety when you're in an office building, right? Who cares? I mean, no one takes ladder training in an office building. So that's the only issue here. Now, of course, steel workers, that's dangerous. Yeah, so those are real. Those are inherently more dangerous jobs. But these have the same inherent danger in them.
Jim, I'm afraid
Yes?
we have to wrap up.
No. Okay, so why is everyone so afraid of energy? Because we told them to be. We told them to be. It's okay. My fault. So incorrect but intentional association with nuclear weapons. We were supposed to scare everyone about nuclear in the Cold War. It was the point of the Cold War. I'm not kidding. It was the point of the Cold War, and it worked. It worked very well. And then inaccurate but purposely simplistic modeling of health effects at low dose, and then the misunderstanding of the amount and nature of nuclear waste. We don't have much of it. You just don't have much of it. Okay, I'll just throw this up so we can end there. Whoops. Stop it. Okay. So if you want waste, there's waste. There's waste. There's waste. That's just not much waste. It's easy. We know how to do it. We're not allowed to deal with it the way we really want to, but it's pretty simple.
Well, let's don't clap.
Let's let people to file out. Feel free to file out. For those who want to stay and throw some questions at Jim, I'm sure he'll be tolerant.
Good.
And I would just like to thank you very much. We enjoyed spending the day with you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.